The Su-35 tried to crush a Gripen, fatal miscalculation. Introduction. Strategic background. The Baltic skies have long been a proving ground where rival doctrines collide. For Russia, the Su-35 stands as the sharp edge of its air dominance strategy, a heavy twin-engine fighter bristling with raw power. Designed to overwhelm opponents through sheer thrust and range. With thrust-vectoring nozzles, long-range missiles, and radar reach that dwarfs many adversaries, Moscow considers it the crown jewel of its air force. But Sweden's answer is not brute force, it is survival through ingenuity. The Swedish JAS 39 Gripen was born out of necessity, a compact, agile and cost-effective fighter that could launch from short, improvised runways, hide in forest clearings, and operate with minimal support. While smaller and less intimidating, it carries one advantage: the Su-35 lacks an ecosystem of electronic warfare, networked data sharing, and adaptability designed to thrive when outnumbered. This clash is more than steel against steel. It is a contest between two visions of air power. Russia believes in overwhelming strength. Sweden believes in resilience and precision. And when these philosophies finally met in the unforgiving airspace of Northern Europe, one pilot's confidence in brute force would set the stage for a fatal miscalculation. Developing context and stakes. Tensions in the Baltic had been simmering for years. Russian jets frequently probed the edges of NATO and Nordic airspace, testing radar coverage and pilot response times. Each intercept was more than a routine maneuver, it was a signal, a reminder of Moscow's reach. For Sweden, a nation outside NATO but firmly in Europe's defense architecture, these encounters carried heavy stakes. The Su-35 represented not just a machine, but a message. Russia could dominate the skies at will. In response, Sweden's Gripen squadrons trained relentlessly for scenarios where they would be outnumbered 5-1. Their doctrine emphasized survival, dispersal, and swift strikes rather than extended battles. Every pilot understood that their role was to deny air superiority, not necessarily to claim it. The stakes were therefore asymmetric. For Russia, the Su-35 was meant to intimidate, to showcase power. For Sweden, the Gripen was about defiance, proving that even a smaller air force could contest the skies. On a cold morning patrol, when one Su-35 pressed deep toward Swedish airspace, these opposing philosophies were no longer theoretical. They would be tested in the unforgiving crucible of real combat maneuvering, intensifying conflict or threat. The encounter began as so many had before: radar locks, shadowing maneuvers, and radio silence. But this time, the Su-35 pilot did not merely posture. He advanced aggressively, closing distance with the clear intent to force the Gripen into submission. The Russian fighter's sheer size and speed filled the sky like a stormfront, daring the smaller jet to hold its ground. Inside the Gripen's cockpit, the Swedish pilot felt the pressure of uneven odds. His training had drilled into him that survival, not bravado, was the goal. Yet retreating too quickly could hand Moscow a propaganda victory. Every move mattered, and every hesitation could mean the end. The Su-35's pilot pressed harder, banking into aggressive turns, cutting angles that suggested a looming missile lock. From the Russian perspective, it was a game of intimidation, one he believed the smaller Swedish fighter could not endure. But intimidation can breed overconfidence, tactical and technical breakdown. The Gripen's sensors quietly tracked, its pilot resisting the urge to react hastily. In that tense moment, the imbalance of power in the skies seemed overwhelming, yet hidden within the pressure was the first opening Sweden's fighter would seize. On paper, the duel seemed hopelessly uneven. The Su-35 flankery was one of Russia's most formidable air superiority fighters. Twin Saturn AL-41F1S engines producing over 60,000 pounds of thrust vectoring nozzles that allowed the aircraft to pivot and roll at impossible angles, and a powerful Urbasi radar capable of tracking dozens of targets at long range. Armed with beyond visual range R-77 and R-27 missiles, as well as short-range R-73s, the Su-35 was built to dominate. Its doctrine emphasized aggressive control of the skies: overwhelm, pursue, destroy. But the Gripen's strength lay in a different domain. Saab's design philosophy had created a fighter that embraced versatility over brute power. Its PSO-5A radar, while smaller, was supplemented by an advanced electronic warfare suite designed not just to hide the Gripen, but to blind and confuse its opponent. The Swedish jet operated seamlessly within a data link network, allowing pilots to share targeting information in real time. Even a single Gripen was never truly alone when supported by ground radars and other aircraft. Moreover, the Gripen's design embraced agility and economy of movement, with a smaller radar cross-section, quicker response cycles, and the ability to launch modern AIM-120 AMR/AMS with precision guidance. It turned its weaknesses into tactical strengths. Where the Su-35 was loud and intimidating, the Gripen was elusive and calculating. Mini-resolution or tactical pause. The first clash came fast. The Su-35 dove hard, engines screaming, its nose snapping toward the Gripen in a maneuver meant to trap the smaller jet in its radar cone. A less disciplined pilot might have panicked, broken sharply, and exposed his tail. But the Swedish pilot stayed measured. rolling away just far enough to deny a clean lock while keeping the Su-35 within his sensor's grasp. For a moment the skies seemed to pause to fighters circling, each pilot calculating the other's limits. The Su-35 loomed with raw force, yet its aggression left faint cracks in its approach. Every violent turn bled fuel and momentum. Every attempt to force dominance revealed impatience. Inside the Gripen.com training routines guided the pilot's hand. His aircraft was not built to win a battle of raw thrust, it was built to exploit overreach. By refusing to commit too soon, he created space, waiting for the Su-35 to make the very mistake doctrine predicted, pressing too hard, too fast. This lull was not retreat but preparation. The Gripen used its electronic warfare systems to probe, testing the Russians' radar, mapping responses. To an outside observer, the Gripen looked cornered. To the pilot inside, the duel was slowly tilting. The pause was his shield, and soon it would become his sword. Escalation and second wave of action. The pause ended with sudden violence. The Su-35 pilot, frustrated by the Gripen's evasive discipline, pushed his aircraft harder. He lit the afterburners, closing distance with a burst of speed meant to corner the smaller jet. From his perspective, hesitation meant weakness, and weakness deserved a crushing strike. He had the bigger jet, the better radar, and the advantage in fuel and weapons. All he needed was for the Gripen to break. But the Swedish pilot knew the danger of responding on the Russians' terms. He stayed measured, forcing the Su-35 to keep pressing, letting the bigger aircraft burn precious fuel with every aggressive maneuver. The Gripen hugged low altitude, using the curvature of the Earth to cut the Russians' radar reach. Its electronic warfare suite pulsed in carefully timed bursts, breaking locks and feeding distorted data back into the Su-35's systems. Inside the Russian cockpit, irritation grew. His radar showed flickers where there should have been certainty. His instincts told him the kill was close. Yet every time he thought he had the Gripen cornered, the smaller fighter slipped just out of reach. Aggression became impatience. Impatience edged toward recklessness. The Gripen, seemingly defensive, was shifting posture. Each maneuver mapped the Su-35's rhythm, building a picture of his opponent's habits. When the Russian dove too hard, the Swedish pilot noted the lag in recovery. When he pitched too sharp, the Gripen marked the bleed in speed. The second wave of the duel was no longer about survival, it was about setting the trap. The skies over the Baltic turned into a psychological battlefield. One pilot relied on brute force, the other on patience. And as the Su-35 pressed in for what he believed would be the decisive strike, he failed to see that he had already given the Gripen exactly what it wanted, an opening that would flip the fight. Approaching the climax strike, the Russian pilot believed he was moments from victory. His Su-35 loomed behind the Gripen, sensors sweeping, missiles armed. To him, the smaller jet was on the verge of collapse. The data seemed to confirm it. The Gripen's radar return was faint, its maneuvers cautious, almost retreating. He pressed harder, convinced that sheer momentum would crush his foe. But appearances can deceive. Inside the Gripen, the Swedish pilot had been quietly gathering everything he needed. The data link fed him updates from ground-based radars, giving him a wider picture of the battlefield than the Su-35 could ever see alone. His electronic warfare systems had already tested the Russians' responses, exposing where the Urbisi radar faltered under deception. The Gripen was not retreating, it was coiling. The Russian pushed into a steep dive, forcing closure distance for an infrared missile shot. Yet in doing so, he surrendered altitude and fuel efficiency. His heavy fighter bled energy with every maneuver, trading endurance for speed in short bursts. The Gripen, lighter and more efficient, rode the wave, avoiding panic while keeping its angles tight. The moment came when the Su-35 banked hard, trying to cut across the Gripen's nose for the kill. For the Swedish pilot, this was the signal he had been waiting for. The Russian had overcommitted, turning aggression into vulnerability. The Gripen snapped into position, its radar lock flashing green, AIM-120 missile primed. In an instant, the dynamic of the fight reversed. The hunter had lunged too far, exposing his flank. The Swedish pilot.com, under pressure, had maneuvered the fight into his zone of control. The sky, once dominated by the thunder of Russian engines, now belonged to precision and patience. The Gripen had found its chance to strike. True resolution and immediate aftermath. The Gripen's cockpit filled with the steady tone of missile lock. The Swedish pilot had the advantage, clear, calculated, undeniable. With one firm press, an AIM-120 AMRAAM streaked off the rail, invisible to the naked eye, yet lethal in its certainty. It carved through the cold air, guided by precision and a web of electronic support that made the Gripen's smaller frame far deadlier than the Russian had assumed. Inside the Su-35, alarms screamed. The Russian pilot had seconds to react. He broke hard, dumping flares, twisting his thrust-vectoring nozzles in desperate post-stall maneuvers. But the very qualities that made the Su-35 spectacular at air shows betrayed it here. Those violent movements cost speed, bled energy, and revealed a simple truth. Brute force could not erase a tactical mistake. The missile found its mark. A blinding flash tore through the silence of the sky, and the flanker's dominance evaporated in an instant. where moments earlier the Su-35 had pressed its advantage. Now nothing remained but falling debris and a sobering lesson. For the Gripen pilot, there was no celebration, only focus. He leveled his jet, scanning for new threats, ensuring his escape path remained open. In his ears, the calm voices of controllers confirmed what he already knew. The impossible duel had ended in Sweden's favor. The aftermath carried weight beyond the wreckage. The encounter had proven that superior thrust and size were not guarantees of victory. Electronic warfare, data integration, and patient tactics had turned the tide. The Su-35's fatal miscalculation lay not in its machine but in its pilot's belief that intimidation alone could secure dominance. In the gray Baltic skies, silence returned, but nothing was the same. Strategic reflection and closing thoughts. The duel between the Su-35 and the Gripen was not simply an isolated clash above the Baltic. It was a window into the evolving character of air combat in the 21st century. For years, Russian doctrine had leaned heavily on intimidation, placing its faith in large, powerful aircraft that could project dominance through sheer size, thrust, and missile capacity. The Su-35, the pinnacle of that philosophy, was supposed to represent an unshakable guarantee of superiority. Yet in the space of a single engagement, that belief was called into question. The Gripen's success did not come from having the biggest engines or the most intimidating silhouette. Instead, it came from adaptability. Sweden's design philosophy had always centered around survival under pressure, operating from dispersed bases, denying an enemy easy targets, and thriving when outnumbered. By pairing electronic warfare systems with advanced data link integration, the Gripen created a combat ecosystem far larger than its small airframe suggested. In the duel, that advantage proved decisive. The pilot was never truly alone. His aircraft was an extension of a broader network of radars and sensors, something the Su-35, for all its brute strength, could not match. For Russia, the implications were sobering. The Su-35's pilot fell victim not to inferior skill, but to flawed assumptions. Overconfidence in the fighter's supermaneuverability and raw thrust blinded him to the subtler dynamics of the battle. By pressing too hard, he allowed the Gripen to exploit what Russian doctrine rarely admits. Even the most powerful fighter can be undone by information, asymmetry, and disciplined patience. Strategically, this duel reinforced lessons already shaping Western doctrine. NATO planners have long understood that wars will not be won by dogfighting alone. Instead, victory depends on denying the enemy information while enhancing one's own. Smaller nations like Sweden, unable to field massive fleets, have invested in systems that turn single aircraft into nodes in a broader defensive web. This encounter validated that strategy in dramatic fashion. The costs of failure were also clear. For Russia, the loss of a Su-35 was more than material, it carried symbolic weight. The aircraft had been marketed as untouchable, a symbol of Moscow's technological prowess. Watching it undone by a smaller, lighter jet shook assumptions not only in Russian doctrine, but across the global arms market. In the end, the battle was not about which aircraft was better on paper. It was about which pilot fought within a system built for modern realities. The Gripen pilot embodied that principle, measured, connected, and patient. The Russian pilot relied on intimidation and brute strength, but in doing so, overlooked the finer details of modern warfare. The message was undeniable. In the age of electronic warfare and networked combat, brains outmatch brawn, and information is the ultimate weapon. Extended future-looking epilogue. The clash between the Su-35 and the Gripen did more than decide a single encounter, illuminated the trajectory of future airpower. The duel distilled a lesson that militaries worldwide cannot ignore. Brute force and raw performance are no longer enough to guarantee air superiority. The skies now favor those who integrate information, exploit electronic warfare, and fight as part of a seamless network. For Sweden, the Gripen's success validated a doctrine shaped by necessity. A small nation surrounded by larger powers could never afford fleets of heavy fuel-hungry fighters. Instead, Sweden built a system around resilience, aircraft that could scatter to hidden highway bases, pilots trained to fight outnumbered, and jets designed to carry advanced electronics rather than sheer bulk. The victory showed that survivability and adaptability are as decisive as thrust and missile range. For Russia, the encounter was a harsher reality check. The Su-35 had been marketed as a symbol of dominance, supermaneuverable, powerful, and built to intimidate. But its defeat revealed cracks in a doctrine that leans too heavily on spectacle. In the coming years, Moscow must reckon with the growing dominance of digital warfare, drone swarms, and AI-assisted combat, all areas where brute strength cannot substitute for adaptability. Looking ahead, the world's next-generation fighters, the Tempest, the FCAs, and America's NGAD, are already being designed with this philosophy in mind. Stealth, networked sensors, unmanned wingman, and electronic dominance. The Gripen's victory was not an outlier but a preview of the battles to come. The skies over the Baltic may have fallen quiet after that duel, but the echoes remain. Air combat's future belongs not to the loudest machine, but to the smartest system. And in that future, one miscalculation can decide everything.